Everyone ready? Okay. Exploring his oblivion, Chapter 4. Yoru pressed his forehead against Zion's. The crisp breeze of the night rolled into the window and spread through the chamber of his lordship. Lying there, on the bed, was Zion and his raven lover. Zion laid motionless in between his silk bed sheets, carefully tucked away into comfort. Yoru laid beside the mage flat on his stomach, staring down at the man he had developed overwhelming feelings for. Few moons had passed since the fateful encounter in the dining hall that evening. Although the two knightly lovers' schedules did not quite coincide, they found moments for one another. Due to their significant difference in status, all of their meetings were of the highest classification and strictly kept to evenings. Yoru pulled away from Zion's forehead and rose from the bed. Unclothed, he ambled over to the chamber window where he stared down into the palace garden. He placed his firm hands onto the window, still, and he can feel his heartbeat in his ears. He had forgotten he had spent all of his time leisurely bracing himself for his impulsive endeavors. Cursing underneath his breath, it was transparent in his mind that he had been too selfish. How could you forget the mission? He could imagine his superiors reprimanding him for his failure. Yoru knew his palace almost inside out, and with the help of his accomplice and their nightly routines, he was able to uncover far more secrets than intended. Inside sources are helpful, of course. His eyes narrowed into the night, realizing he was the only one who could do this. The mission that was left to the most patient of all, a slow burn. His village depended on it. Hmm, Zion moaned from across the room, rousing from his blissful slumber. Come back to bed, he timidly requested. Yoru shifted his gaze to meet the languorous boy's eyes. His eyes softened upon meeting the two brown pools that glimmered in the moonlight. I should go. His voice was a deep hum against the twilight. Zion took a final drowsy breath and sat up. His shirt draped across his chest, allowing for glimpses of his skin to be shown. He crawled out of bed and lazily made his way over to the window. He wrapped his frail arm around Yoru's torso, hugging into the dip of his waist. The stars are beautiful tonight, he commentated. Yoru shifted his gaze once more to meet the height of Zion. His smirk was dusted by the moonlight. The softest look bathed him in a warm glow of affection. A spray of stars are dull compared to the light of Zion's focus, revealing in the delighted reaction of the scenery and a much needed
Reveling! It's
distraction. Reveling, sorry. He brushed his thumbs over the mage's forehead. He whispered, Yes, they are. Zion's cheeks flushed delicately, basking in the moonlight. He shivered once the chilling breeze of the night hit his bare skin. Now, my dearest, Yoru sighed. The sun will rise over the horizon soon. The mage quickly understood the cue and he hesitantly unraveled his arm around the raven's waist. His face quickly dropped. Yoru pressed his lips against Zion's cheek as a peace offering and an apology. Words were not always necessary. Zion offered a meek smile in return and stepped a few steps backwards, allowing Yoru his freedom. Yoru half heartedly threw his clothes on and jumped out the palace window, grasping onto overgrown bush and branches on his way down. Zion, from the comfort of his window, watched his lover disappear into the night. The inevitable emptiness returned, the reminder that an empty bed awaited him. Goodbye, he called out to the night, waving a small gesture. He remembered that tomorrow would be a new day and that he would meet his lover once again. He sauntered to his bed and lied down once more, allowing the comfort to sweep over him. He pondered of the warmth from Yoru's breath, and it was a soulless thought. His eyes fluttered closed, and he was content once more. The morning sun bled through the mesh curtains of Zion's chamber, beaming onto the Lord's eyes. His brows furrowed under the discomfort of the sun. At the door, there was a quiet knock and a calling for the mage. My lord, the familiar voice of the loyal servant Kylie exclaimed, You have a meeting with the king's court. Zion shot up, completely neglecting his duty as a member of the court. Yes, please come in. He hurried out of bed, straightening his appearance before the chamber door opened and the maid stepped in. She was carrying stacks of corsets in her arms. Good morning, she began. I've brought you some of the finest corsets. Zion nodded, showcasing a smile. He stood before his dressing mirror in the secluded corner of the room. Kylie hurried over and set the corsets down on a nearby desk, spreading them in a manner that allowed for selection. Zion glanced over, simply pointing at corsets that he fancied. There's a new member of the court, Kylie trailed, raising an eyebrow while she grabbed the carefully selected pieces of stitching. Hmm? The maid stared at his reflection, with not a single ounce of curiosity. His mind wandered on the only thing he could think of. As of today, there will be another general for the army. Now that you have a mage school, he will oversee the foot soldiers. Zion perked up, interested in who it could possibly be. Perhaps it was an old friend he fought alongside. Kylie wrapped in a navy blue satin corset with gold trim around Zion's waist. This one will complement your complexion, Kylie chipperly chimed. I like it best on you. Zion nodded. There was not much of a second thought on the idea. Zion's roused curiosity was now focused on who this new general could be. There were only a handful worthy enough of such a position. This is fine. Zion stopped Kylie from removing his corset. I'm interested to meet this, new member. Kylie nodded and tightened the laces on the mage's corset. In the king's throne room, His Majesty Colby was discussing the means of including the new general into his court and turning him into nobility. Rose chimed in. Your Majesty, we've discussed this. All you need to do is allow him to undergo the ceremony, and he can become a member. Rose! Colby wailed. The hint of a heavy annoyance lingered in his tone. Your voice is so bothersome! Has anyone ever told you that? Yes, Your Majesty. Rose slumped back into her chair, sighing. Devon! Colby snapped at his beck and call. His secondary assistant stood at His Majesty's side. Give me the rundown of the ceremony. Devon rubbed the laziness from his eyes and tried to recall the process of the ceremony. Sire, I believe you can simply call him a member of your court, he concluded. Colby bellowed. Yes! Ah, Devon, I can always depend on you to steer me in the right direction. Your Majesty, Rose straightened in her seat. Colby merely raised his hand, and Rose slumped back into her chair. The second general chuckled, throwing his head back in amusement. Your Majesty, you are delightfully funny. Colby flushed. Oh, you don't mean that. He fluttered his eyelashes, following another bellowing laugh from the general. The door opened, and in the doorway stood Lord Zion, his faithful maid, and the escort guard. The guard announced to the room, Lord Zion and his dowry maid, Kylie. The maid curtsied and made direct eye contact with the secondary advisor. For a brief moment, the sleep in his eyes disappeared. Colby struck the back of Devon's back, laughing out loud. Zion, welcome! Please, please come in. Zion stepped into the room, grinning from ear to ear. Although overwhelming, King Colby was pleasant company to keep. The young king stood from his throne and waddled down the steps, opening his arms to the hierarch mage. Zion, he braced him. Have you met the newest army general? Before Zion could respond, his eyes met the second general and immediately he was flooded with memories. Kazi, he called out. There standing before the throne was Kazi, one of the most talented archers in the kingdom, and confidently said, perhaps the entire nation. Kazi could utilize any weapon and was swift to learn new methods of combat. He proved a fine general. Kazi and Zion had a fond history. They fought alongside one another in the Great War, where they fought for the Light Skin Kingdom after the current king's father's passing. At the time, both were quite young. They grew up together in the cavalry. Zion, Kazi let out a breathy smile. Zion raced into his arms. I thought you were dead. His eyes swelled with tears. Me? Never, he assured with a coy smirk. Oh, lovely, you're already acquainted, Colby exclaimed, clasping his hands together. A trusted member of this court is fond of this highly capable individual. Ceremony or not, welcome to the court, my boy. Kazi and the king firmly shook hands. It had been sealed. We shall celebrate this occasion through food and drink, my favorite pastime. Devon, if you will please let it be known that we will have a feast tonight. Devon arose from his seat, dusting off his shirt. He bowed to the king before seeing himself out of the room. In the span of few hours, some of the most important people in the kingdom were notified of the celebration. Similarly to Zion's celebration dinner, those of high standings attended the momentous occasion. Dressed in some of Zion's finest clothes, he was seated beside his old friend at the dining table. It had felt like a million years had passed, and it was refreshing to meet a pair of familiar eyes. Kazi, who had always been fond of Zion, was especially enamored with him tonight. In the same fashion of the last dinner, maids and butlers were lined up on opposite sides of the room. Zion noticed Yoru, who he had hoped to see all night. He signaled out to his secret lover, mouthing words that were incomprehensible. Zion. Kazi scooted closer to the mage in an effort to keep his attention. The mage's focus shifted back to his friend. Ah, I'm sorry. I still cannot believe it's you, here in the flesh. You look as magnificent as ever. A heavenly body you are indeed. With poise, he drew Zion's hand from in his lap and placed a gentle kiss on the dorsal. Zion could not help but feel flattered. How charming! How could I not be when I'm in the presence of such a powerful figure? You are quite the accomplished man. Yes. Before he could close his sentence, Yoru separated the two of them. He stood directly between their seating and addressed his lordship. My lord, I apologize for inconvenience, but your suit is just off a tad. Allow me to fix it for you? Yoru's eyes burned with a determination not yet experienced. Zion could not pinpoint what the emotion was, but he sensed the urgency. Kazi, if you will please excuse me, I must look my sharpest for this substantial night. Zion excused himself and he followed after the butler, who led him into the kitchen and down to the butler's quarters. It was typical of Yoru to feign an aloof act, but it had suddenly become clear he was possessive. Yoru had been displeased. It was difficult for him to watch Zion entertain Kanzi's antics. He eased a suffocating hold around Zion's waist and clutched him to his side. His opposite fingertips sunk into his cheeks as he roughly tilted his stupefied gaze, turning him to greet his own simmering stare. You put on quite a show out there. Tell me, what's so fascinating about that half-witted twat? You've had your fun parading around like an idiot, he snarled, laughing bitterly as he pressed his cold lips into his ear. So I think it's only fair I have my share of fun too. Thus, the man tugged Zionus to his knee, kissing him until he was clawing into his grasp. He retained the firm hold around his head, pressed his palms against the wall behind him until Zion's trembling hands wedged just enough space between their heated bodies. Zion drank the air. To this, Yoru cracked an enraptured grin. He slowly fumbled the mage's moist bottom lip, tipping his head as he panted. How endearing, he whispered, that sinister smirk tapping into his syrupy tone. His flustered appearance serves as his amusement. On your knees, he demanded, his tone shifting to that of a general, perhaps in a way to mock his competition. Zion obliged, dropping to his knees, still panting and drooling from the oral strike. The raven pulled down his trousers, springing free of his erection. It pulsated eagerly, anticipating the warmth of Zion's affection. Zion placed his hand on the base of his cock, and in comparison, it was much smaller than his length. Zion wondered how he had been able to take it so many times. Yoru placed a reassuring hand on his lover's head, gripping at as much hair as he could for leverage. The mage hesitantly wrapped his mouth around the tip. It was difficult to fit the entirety of the mass in his mouth, but he became familiar with the taste. He looked up at Yoru. He was desperate to find the release. The frustration Yoru tried to hold in was developing on his face. With a forceful arm, he pushed Zion's head to take the entire length at once. Hmm! Zion's muffled moan filled the raven's ears. Zion rapidly gained confidence and on his own accord bobbed his head back and forth to accommodate the raven. Despite not having very much experience, Zion was an expert in the art of satisfaction. He was quick to pick up positive and negative cues alike. Raising his eyes to meet the raven's, It was apparent it was enjoying the experience. The hall filled with slurping and sucking noises of the erotic variety, the kind to rouse anyone. Yoru pulled his length away from the mage and brought him to his feet, picking him up and guiding his legs around his waist. He snickers when Zion reddens. What's with you? I don't bite. Come on, open your mouth. With a mischievous hum, he kissed him until Zion's eyes glistened in hazy captivation. The raven was careful to removing his mate's trousers, gently pulling them down over his arse to ensure nothing to rip. While orally stimulating him, Yoru guided the tip of his cock to the boy's hole, teasing it in and out. Through suffocating kisses, Zion moaned in retaliation. Many of his efforts to speak were denied, and instead turned into muffled groans. After careful preparation with a single thrust, Yoru penetrated the mage. Good boy. The butler breathed against his lover's lips, breathed. Oh my god. You take it so well, Zion gasped. His body not yet settled with the girth the raven provided. Each in instituting thrust was unfailingly the most difficult. Over time, though, Zion was typically able to adjust. Yoru's grip on the boy's legs remained firm, a reminder that he would never let him go. He would never let anyone touch him. He was the only being on the earth allowed the pleasure. Zion's arms secured themselves around Yoru's neck, where he found himself squeezing in moments such as these. He was breathless with every thrust, weak to every word. He was a puddle before his master. Yoru unleashed powerful thrusts at a quickened pace, his anger fueling his sexuality. How dare you look at another man like that? He scolded, breathless as he let out an angry groan. Zion squealed, clawing at the raven's back and leaving marks that would no doubt remain for later. You belong to me, Yoru assured. The mage nodded, understanding the state at which his lover could reach. He moaned. The slick sound of skin slapping against one another filled the hall and the rooms. It was lucky that everyone was busy with the lavish dinner. Zion could feel the pressure building in his stomach, the release he was ready to remove. Yoru, I'm going to. Then come for me. It'll prove you belong to me. Zion could feel his face become warm. Vulnerable to Yoru's words, he exploded. Throwing his head back, he could feel himself twitching and pulsating as he reached his climax. Yoru allowed the boy onto his feet, panting himself but still as erect as ever. I'm sorry, my dear. You were expecting to return to your dinner? He chided. Not until I'm finished with you. To be continued.